Module 12, Fluids and Electrolytes. Let's first begin with some important terminology here. The first of which is euhydration. This is what we call normal hydration. So when a person is hydrated, they are in a state of euhydration. Then we have involuntary dehydration. This is where individuals are consuming sufficient fluids to satisfy or assuage their thirst, but the fluid amount that they're consuming isn't enough to offset some of the fluid losses that are happening. The next term is hypohydration. This is where individuals will purposefully dehydrate themselves. Case in point here, wrestlers that are trying to make a certain weight class will often use hypohydration or dehydration that's self-imposed to make a lower weight class. The fourth term here is hyperhydration. This is where an individual will be in positive water balance. So they're over-consuming fluids, so they're in this hyperhydrated state. So what are the functions of water? Well, water makes a wonderful transport medium. The best example here is blood. About half of blood is going to be made up of water. The plasma is the liquid portion of blood. This is where all the stuff is floating around in that you could just about imagine. Lipoproteins, proteins, glucose, everything, waste products. All of that's floating around in the plasma part of blood. So this is the watery portion. So water plays a very, very important role in transporting these substances. Water is also going to provide structural integrity to cells. It helps maintain the shape of the cells. It's a wonderful lubricant. The best example here that many of you may be familiar with is synovial fluid in joints that keeps the joint fluid and reduces the friction wear on the joint. Water also makes a wonderful reactive medium. So in other words, chemical reactions are partaking in their reactions within water. So water is useful for reactions like hydrolysis, condensation reactions. It's also a great solvent for things like glucose, and vitamins, minerals, proteins, and enzymes. So it's a very important reactive medium as far as chemical reactions are concerned in the human body. It's also useful in maintaining body temperature. So water is very heat conductive. It's actually about 26 times faster than air to remove heat. So it's very effective at getting rid of heat, which is why we use sweat to cool off our bodies. Evaporative cooling. So we have sweat that comes onto the surface of the skin, and that sweat evaporates very, very quickly, and it's going to carry with it a bunch of heat. So it's very important in maintaining core body temperature, particularly when we have large amounts of heat being produced as a result of activity. Water is also useful at maintaining the body's pH at about 7.4. So if we take a look at what's called the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation down here, the main component towards the end of the equation, the way I have it written here, is where we have water combining with carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid, which then will form bicarbonate. And remember, bicarbonate is really important at buffering any acid that is being released into the bloodstream here, represented by the hydrogen ion. So water is very, very important at helping to maintain this pH. It's also a critical to blood volume maintenance. So we need to have water in blood in order to maintain things like blood pressure. The blood pressure is very much so affected by the amount of plasma volume or water that is in blood, which would then affect cardiovascular function. And one of the main components here that we're concerned about with athletes is going to be stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that we can eject from the left ventricle per beat. Well, if you have less plasma volume or less water, then that means that stroke volume is going to suffer. And we know that through exercise training, that stroke volume is one of the major adaptations that athletes have within the heart that enable them to perform cardiorespiratorily at high levels. So if you want to improve cardiovascular functioning and improve the ability of an athlete to perform cardiovascular types of exercise, they need to improve their stroke volume. And the way to do that is to simply have sufficient amount of plasma volume there. So water is very important to maintaining that. So how are fluids absorbed? Well, the primary site of absorption for water in the gastrointestinal tract is going to be the duodenum and jejunum. About half or a little over half of any fluid that's presented to the GI tract is going to be absorbed. So that's a huge amount of water that's absorbed in the small intestine. The colon or the large intestine is also going to absorb a huge amount of fluid. So the water that gets to the point of the large intestine now, about 80 to 90% of that fluid is actually going to be absorbed. So there's a large amount of absorption that's going on in the large intestine as well. So I know that oftentimes it's presented that the large intestine is the area where the majority of fluid is absorbed, but we don't want to forget about the duodenum and jejunum where we're getting a significant amount of absorption going on there as well. So the amount in the large intestine is going to account for about 15% of the total fluid load as far as absorption. So there's a huge amount going on as far as absorption is concerned in the small intestine. So how does this happen? How do we get water absorption? Well, it's mostly passive diffusion. So it's based on the osmotic gradient. Now I'll get a little bit more into osmolality and osmolarity a little bit later on in this lecture. But essentially the solutes that are dissolved in the enterocyte, within the enterocyte, and also in the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract, those amounts, those concentrations really is what's going to drive the fluid in the direction of either into the enterocyte or in some cases pulled out of the enterocyte and into the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract. So there is an osmotic gradient there. You could also have osmosis go against the osmotic gradient. And this happens more so in the small intestine than in the colon, but that can happen as well. So this is all dependent upon the solute concentration. What are the sources of water? Well, we get 60% of water from fluids. So if you're drinking any kind of fluid, you're going to get some fluid that way. About 30% fluid is going to come from food, and this is really dependent upon how moist the food is. So something like a cookie is going to be much harder, so it has less moisture content and it has less fluid, versus something like pizza may have a little bit more moisture content there. About 10% of fluid does come from metabolic water. So when you break things down as far as milliliters are concerned, so about food, 700 to 1,000 milliliters of fluid there. Fluids, as in beverages, about 550 to 1,500 milliliters. And metabolically speaking, from conducting all of those metabolic pathways and producing ATP, we're going to get about 200 to 300 milliliters from there as a source as well. So how do we distribute water throughout the body? What determines this? Well, first off, we want to talk about how much of the human body is actually water. Just a little bit over half of the body, as far as body mass is concerned, is water. And we can break that down or subdivide it into, basically in the extracellular compartments here, you've got about 20% of that fluid. So 5% as plasma volume, as we talked about earlier. Remember, that's important for stroke volume. And then about 15% of water is found in interstitial spaces. This is the area between cells. So there's some fluid there as well. The 40% remainder here is found within the cell or intracellularly in these intracellular compartments. So muscle, it's important to note, is about 70% water, which really stresses the importance of water to an athlete's performance. So we want to make sure that the muscle has its share of fluid there, which is why hydration is such an important topic in sports nutrition. So how are we going to distribute fluid here? What is affecting the distribution throughout the body? Well, number one, protein content makes a difference. So muscle tissue has a larger amount of water compared with adipose tissue. It begs the question of, are there differences with overweight and obese individuals versus a lean individual? Are they going to have less water or more water? Well, if you think about muscle mass, an athlete typically has more muscle mass, so they're going to have more water within their muscle tissue. So protein content really makes a difference for the athlete. Carbohydrate content of tissues also makes a difference. If you recall from the carbohydrates lecture, about 3 grams of water are going to be stored with each gram of glucose as glycogen. So there's a lot of water being stored with that carbohydrate. Whereas if we look at each gram of triglyceride, we're only storing about 0.1 gram of water there. So carbohydrate and to a limited extent fat is going to affect how much water is being stored in a tissue. Intracellular and extracellular electrolyte concentrations, which is what most people think of when they're thinking about osmolarity, is also a huge player here. So sodium ions, chloride ions, potassium ions, and calcium ions all make a big difference as far as the water distribution in the human body. So let's talk about water balance here. Water balance is all about the intake of water and the output of water. So when water intake and water output are equal, then we are in what's called water balance. And these are hormonally regulated for the most part. We have antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin that regulates water distribution losses in the kidney, as well as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which also regulates kidney losses and retention of fluid. Now, the major difference between these two is that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system utilizes sodium as a way, or sodium ions as a way of regulating fluid balance, whereas antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin does not rely on sodium. So it's a sodium-independent mechanism versus the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is a sodium-dependent mechanism. As far as water losses are concerned, well, we can lose water through urination. So the kidneys will produce about 500 to 1,400 milliliters of fluid every day. Defecation, so feces represents a small amount, about 150 milliliters of loss there. Sweat production in an athlete, this can represent a fairly large or substantial amount, up to about 90% of water loss during exercise. So sweat production can be high. The average person that's not an athlete or exercising in hot, humid conditions, about 450 to 900 milliliters of fluid can be lost this way just from evaporation of fluid on the skin. This, of course, as far as sweat is concerned, is dependent upon environmental conditions. Temperature makes a difference, the humidity. So if you combine temperature and humidity and get high temperatures, high humidity, you're going to have a lot more loss of fluid. Wind velocity also makes a difference because that's going to facilitate the evaporative losses through convective currents. Clothing, the type of clothing you're wearing can make a difference. If you wear clothing that's going to retain heat, that obviously is going to cause you to sweat more. The intensity, the greater the intensity of exercise, the more that you're going to sweat. The duration, the longer you exercise, the more you're going to lose. The conditioning of the individual. A person who is well conditioned will actually sweat a little bit sooner and can maintain core body temperature a little bit better, so they'll have a little bit less of a loss as far as fluid is concerned. The size of the individual, the larger a person is, the more fluid that they can lose through sweat. Then we also have insensible losses through, for example, things like the skin. With perspiration, particularly in a dry environment. I'm here in Las Vegas where it's very dry. We have about 8% humidity, which is basically nothing. You're not going to, just walking around, you're not going to sense the loss of sweat from the skin because you simply don't see it on the skin. So that's an insensible loss. You don't sense this. Whereas when I lived in North Carolina at one point, the humidity was really high there. You're talking about 50, 60% humidity during the summertime, and sweat just pools on your skin. And because of the humidity in the air, it simply doesn't evaporate. So it really depends on the location as far as whether or not you're going to sense these losses. So that is one area of loss that for some people, particularly in the drier or cooler environments, you're not going to be aware of. So that's something that we want to be cognizant of so that we can make sure that if we have an athlete exercising in these environments, that they're replenishing their fluids accordingly. The respiratory tract also represents another type of insensible loss. When we move air into the lung, we have to moisten the air and we have to heat the air up. That's essential to gas exchange. So in general, the cooler the air is going to be, then the more water it's going to basically take up. And then when you breathe that air out, then you're going to lose that fluid. So that represents a loss that we simply don't sense. So if you are exercising during cooler environments, it's cold outside, it's dry air, that bulk movement of air, that minute ventilation, if we're moving more air in and out of the lung, we're going to lose more fluid. So here is a table of the summary of losses in milliliters, and this is just interesting to look at, so I would go ahead and take a look at it at your own leisure. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You've got your insensible losses here, skin and respiratory tract, and then the urine, sweat, and feces, and how much we would lose, and it breaks the conditions down into normal, hot weather, and then prolonged heavy exercise. So we can lose a pretty significant amount, as you can see, with prolonged heavy exercise. About 6.6 liters of fluid. Pretty large amount. So how do certain beverages, foods, or medications affect fluid balance? Well, number one on the list here that I think a lot of people think of with hydration is caffeine. Usually caffeine gets the rap that, hey, if you're going to drink a caffeinated beverage, you're going to be dehydrated. Well, let's take a look at this a little bit more closely. 1 milliliter of water loss is what you can expect with about 1 milligram of caffeine ingestion. So when we take a look at 1 cup of coffee, which is 240 milliliters, that has about 80 milligrams of caffeine in it. So we lose about 80 milliliters of water, but we are drinking 240 milliliters. So the balance of that is still going to be in our favor. So we'll still consume 160 milliliters of water. So this, if you're having a cup of coffee before you exercise, this really isn't a big deal, simply because this is an insignificant loss of fluid. So it's not going to cause a major shift in fluid balance. Now, if you started to have, let's say, 5-6 cups of coffee, then that may present a problem, but a cup of coffee really isn't going to make a significant difference. So that's something we want to be aware of, the caffeine in beverages. Alcohol. Alcohol, I dare say, in moderate amounts can actually contribute to water intake. There's a lot of fluid there if you have a beer, for example. This wouldn't apply to things like, hard liquor, types of liquor that have 100 proof or something like that, shots. There's not a lot of water there. It's basically mostly alcohol. So it's more for beverages like wine or beer or wine coolers. These types of beverages do contain a larger amount of fluid in them versus alcohol. So if we stick within moderation, we should be fine. And what's moderation considered? Well, that would be 2 drinks a day if you're a man and 1 drink per day if you're a woman. Now, some people have asked me whether or not you could save your drinks up during the week and save them up for the weekend. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. So you can't save all your drinks. Let's say you're a woman and you want to save all 5 drinks for the weekend and then have a binge drinking session on the weekend. That certainly would not be advisable, and that's not what we're talking about here. So moderation is on a per day basis, not on a per week basis. So we want to be aware of that as well. So higher intakes of alcohol, like saving up your drinks for the weekend, can have a diuretic effect. So it's going to promote water loss from the body and could potentially lead to dehydration. A high protein diet. The concern here, as we talked about a little bit earlier with higher protein diets, is that we have to deaminate the protein. The amino acids have to be deaminated, so we're going to produce some urea when we do that. And if we produce a bunch of urea, then there's going to be some fluid that's necessary in order to dispose of that urea in urine. So the concern is that higher protein diets may actually increase the need for fluid. So that's something that you might want to monitor as well if an athlete is on a higher protein diet. Over-the-counter medications typically can have some diuretic components to them, so we always want to read up on our medications and make sure that we understand if there's any caffeine in them, or if there's a diuretic effect to those medications. Then we want to take that into consideration with maintaining fluid balance in the athlete. So what are the fluid requirements? Well, optimal hydration should result in urination about every 1 to 2 hours. So every 1 to 2 hours, the kidney should be concentrating some urine. So some general recommendations here as far as adults. A really easy one to use here as far as how can you determine how much fluid someone needs is to use the 1 milliliter per kilocalorie per day. So if you know how many kilocalories an athlete needs every single day, then you're just going to use 1 milliliters per kilocalorie, and then that then becomes the amount of fluid that they should be consuming every single day. You could also use the next equation here, or the next constant here, number 2. This is 35 milliliters per kilogram of usual body mass. So whatever they usually weigh, so they're in a euhydrated state, then you can use 35 milliliters per kilogram. So if you don't know the kilocalorie content that's necessary, you can at least use the 35 milliliters per kilogram of body mass per day and determine, in general, the amount of fluid that's necessary. This is an equation that is typically used in a clinical setting. As a dietitian, I would be using the 35 ml per kg of body mass per day quite often. You could also take the total number of kilocalories that the person needs and divide that by 240. Now 240 here is coming from the fact that 1 cup equals 240 milliliters. So this will actually give you the number of cups needed per day of fluid. So on average, adults need about 2 to 2.5 liters per day of fluid. Of course, this is going to vary depending upon if you're an athlete, not an athlete, the intensity and training, etc. of the regimen. As far as infants are concerned, I threw this in here. Again, same principle. You're taking 1.5 milliliters per kilocalorie per day. You can determine fluid needs that way. Also 150 milliliters per kilogram per day would be another way to do it. In children, 50 to 60 milliliters per kilogram per day. This is the DRI table that you could also use. So this is just another way to come up with an estimation of fluid needs. So go ahead and take a look at this table. And basically, the way that it's working here is that we've got a separation of gender here, males and females, and then there are age groups here for each of these categories, and we have the adequate intake value for the amount of fluid from foods, from beverages, and then the total water. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the notion that we should have about 8 ounces of water every single day, 8 glasses of 8 ounces of water per day. So where did this come from? Is this being pulled out of thin air? Well, it's actually developed from the 70 kilogram male model. So the clinical model here is as such. Basically, we first have to understand the energy requirement. So that's about 38 to 41 kilocalories per kilogram of body mass per day for light to moderate activity. If you do the math on that on a 70 kilogram male, then you're going to end up with about 2660 to 2870 kilocalories per day. For fluid requirements, if you recall our 1 mil per kilocalorie per day, we do the math, and again, 2660 to 2870 milliliters per day, or if we divide that by 240, we get our 11 to 12 8-ounce cups per day of fluid. Now, this does assume certain things as far as the source of water is concerned. So from food, we're saying that we're going to get 750 milliliters or 3 cups of fluid there. Oxidative metabolism, we're getting about 250 milliliters or 1 cup there. For fluid intake, we're going to assume that 1750 to 2000 milliliters or 7 to 8 cups per day of fluid. So this fluid amount has to be from non-caffeinated, non-alcoholic sources in order for this model to be correct. So the 8 glasses of 8 ounces of water per day is actually coming from this clinical model, which is based on a 70 kilogram male. Now, obviously, not everyone is going to need all of this fluid. Some people are going to need more. Some people are going to be needing less. But the point here is that this is a real model that was developed, and this is how it was developed. So here's the big question. Is bottled water better than other sources of water? Well, generally speaking, no. H2O is H2O is H2O. There's no difference chemically as far as the water is concerned. Now, there are some differences in cost. Number one, bottled water is going to be higher than tap water. That's a fact. Somebody has to pay for the plastic bottles. Somebody has to pay for the packaging of the bottles and the labeling. So it does cost us more money. Taste would be really the big one here with athletes. Taste does vary among water bottling companies, among tap water sources. And the main difference comes mainly from the mineral content. So the mineral content makes a large impact in the palatability of the water, whether or not someone's going to like that water. I can tell you that here in Las Vegas, I certainly don't like the way that the water tastes. It has a very, very high mineral content, and it just is not palatable to me. Being from New York, the New York water is a lot less mineral heavy, which tastes different, and that's what I prefer because that's what I grew up on. So it really depends upon where you grew up in the world and the source of the water, whether or not that's the taste that you gravitate towards. So palatability is very, very important and can't be underemphasized simply because if something tastes bad, so if bottled water tastes bad or tastes better, that's going to affect whether or not an athlete is going to have water or not. As far as bottled water is concerned, it's typically filtered. So when you filter water, that means you could lose some minerals and thus the taste can be affected. It isn't necessarily safer than tap water. What's interesting to note is that if the state that the water is bottled in, if that bottled water is shipped within the state, it actually is not regulated by the FDA. So about 60 to 70% of bottled water is actually exempt because of this rule that's in place. However, it doesn't mean that that water is not being regulated. The Environmental Protection Agency does have some stipulations on tap water, so they're monitoring it within state. You can have bottling companies that decide to add minerals back to affect the flavor of the bottled water. They can actually add flavorings to the bottled water, which has been a very popular thing, I would say, in the last decade or so, as far as creating these beverages that will enhance the palatability of water and perhaps allow people to drink water that would otherwise be persuaded not to, simply because of the taste of water. So a lot of the bottled water is actually, very interestingly, simply palatable municipal water. So it's great tasting municipal water that's simply bottled up and then sold to the masses in bottled water. Now, unfortunately, Flint, Michigan recently had issues with their tap water and their city water. So bottled water, yes, would be a great alternative for an area like Flint, Michigan, so that you avoid the lead contamination. So is palatability a problem for an athlete? If this is the case, if the answer is yes, then a use of a filtration system or some sort of water softener or using bottled water that's tasty would be the best alternative, because we want to promote fluid intake in the athlete. So if the athlete is not going to like the beverage that you're giving them, then they're probably not going to consume it. So we want to make sure that palatability is high on the list for the athlete. What about international travel? Well, this is a concern that water in foreign countries perhaps may not be under strict guidance and regulation of some sort of governmental agency, and therefore they may pose a risk for infection of microbes. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the course later on under Module 26. So this is where bottled water may actually be a better alternative if you're staying abroad. How is thirst stimulated? Well, in order to get the sensation of being thirsty, you actually have to be dehydrated. So once you are thirsty, you actually are dehydrated to a certain extent. So what happens? Well, blood volume is going to decrease because there's a fluid loss. So if you recall, that plasma volume is mostly water, and that amount of water now is less, which means that the solute concentrations like sodium, we have sodium ions that are going to increase in concentration because there's less water. So it looks like sodium levels are much higher in the blood when you lose or remove some of the water from the plasma. When this happens, when sodium ion concentrations elevate because of a loss of water, that's going to trigger thirst receptors in the hypothalamus to tell us, hey, we're thirsty. So it's all about the sodium concentrations in blood. When these concentrations are elevated because we lost fluid, you could also get it from eating salty snacks and the amount of sodium in blood increases, that's going to stimulate the thirst receptors in the hypothalamus. So the threshold, as far as losses are concerned, are going to be about 1.5 to 2 liters of fluid loss. So there's a pretty significant amount of fluid loss to be really, really thirsty. Now, the problem with fluid loss is that we're also going to constrict blood vessels, which means that we're going to have a reduced amount of blood flow available for the working muscle. That's also going to increase blood pressure. So this poses challenges to the athlete as they're trying to exercise, and is certainly not the state that we want to be in. We don't want to be in this dehydrated state. We're also going to, in an effort to save water, the kidneys are going to excrete less fluid. So you're going to lose less water through the kidneys and urine. What are the physiological responses to dehydration? What happens when we're dehydrated? Well, we're going to get an increase in all of the following areas. We're going to have an increase in gastrointestinal distress. Plasma osmolality is going to increase. So remember, that's really all about the sodium concentration in blood. Those levels are going to increase. Blood will actually get thicker. If you think about removing the watery portion of blood, that means now there's a higher concentration of red blood cells, which means it's going to have a much higher viscosity. So blood's going to be thicker, which is actually a little bit more challenging to pump throughout the system. So the heart's going to have a little bit more trouble in pumping blood out and maintaining a good stroke volume. Heart rate is going to increase. If we decrease the amount of stroke volume and we want to maintain a given level of cardiac output, we've got to compensate by increasing heart rate. The core body temperature is going to increase, which then is going to promote sweating. So there's going to be a redistribution of red blood cells from the core or the central cavity of the human body to the periphery. So we're moving blood from the central area of the human body and pushing it out to the skin. So that means there's less available blood now to the working muscle, which means that if muscle is receiving less blood, that means there's less oxygen getting to the muscle, which means that we're going to rely more on non-oxidative metabolism and thus muscle glycogen for ATP production. We're also going to get a decrease in plasma volume. So we saw that earlier. We reduced the amount of overall water. We're going to reduce the splanchnic renal blood flow. So the GI tract is going to receive less blood flow, as well as the kidneys. The central blood volume that I was telling you about is going to be reduced because we're pushing some of that blood volume now to the skin. That also causes a reduction in central venous pressure. Central venous pressure is very, very important in preload and bringing in fluid into the heart. Stroke volume is going to be decreased. If we have lower central venous pressure, lower preload, that means we're going to have a lower stroke volume. Cardiac output can be reduced. that spells a reduction in performance and endurance capacity. And our sweating rate can also be decreased as well at core body temperature. So this table shows you the symptoms that someone may experience when they are dehydrated, and that's all based on the percent of body mass loss. So over here in this column we have the percent body mass loss, so 0, and then we go down 1 through 11% body mass loss. And so, for example, if someone is, let's say, 3%, has a 3% body mass loss because they lost 3% of their body mass in fluid, that could cause impatience and a decreased blood volume. So there are symptoms that we know you'll typically see with a certain amount of body loss. What's interesting is that athletes can actually be a little bit resilient to this, and they can tolerate up to about a 3% loss in body mass fluid and not experience too much discomfort. What are the clinical signs and symptoms of dehydration? Well, it could be simply nothing more than a headache, fatigue. They could have decreased appetite, also known as anorexia. They could have lightheadedness, poor skin turgor. So the skin loses kind of its flexibility, so to speak, a little bit. You can get skin tenting on the forehead, so the skin tends to bundle together a little bit if you squeeze it together. You get concentrated urine, so somebody who's dehydrated, their urine may actually look very dark yellow and may have a heavy odor to it. They'll have a decreased urine output. Their eyes will sink back into their head a little bit because there's a loss of fluid. Mucous membranes of the mouth and nose dry out. You can have orthostatic blood pressure changes, meaning that the person's more sensitive to changes in body position and the way that blood pressure changes. Tachycardia, so their heart rate can be over 100 beats per minute at rest. The specific gravity of urine will end up being greater than 1.008, which is, by the way, a great way of measuring whether or not someone is dehydrated. And that's taking a urine sample and using a specific gravity test bulb to measure the amount of specific gravity that urine has. The color of urine can be used as a simple test for the athlete. And this diagram over on the right-hand corner, although the colors don't really manifest well on the screen, the one on the right here is supposed to indicate someone who's well hydrated. So urine should be pale yellow and not have an odor, whereas somebody who has dehydrated or is dehydrated has urine that is very, very dark yellow and has a very strong odor. Sometimes it can even be a little bit orange in color. What are the heat-related illnesses associated with dehydration? Well, heat cramps are the smallest problem out of dehydration here that we can experience. It's the least severe. The signs and symptoms here, most athletes will talk about muscle cramping. And so basically to treat heat cramps, you're going to stretch the muscle, you're going to moderate the activity, reduce it a little bit, pull it back, and then provide some fluids as well as some electrolytes to solve this issue. Now we move on to heat exhaustion, which is the next most severe. And signs and symptoms here, you can have an athlete that profusely sweats. They'll have cold, clammy skin. They may be faint. They will have a rapid pulse. They can experience hypotension. As far as the treatment is concerned, we need to make sure that they stop exercising immediately, get them into a shaded area, cooler area, have them lie down and give them some fluids, and possibly some medical attention if it's severe enough. As far as heat stroke is concerned, this is where the person stops sweating. That's very, very dangerous, as we know that sweating provides a very important mechanism to the human body as far as being able to cool the body off. So one of the symptoms that you'll see is that they have dry, hot skin. And this is very, very dangerous. It will lead to muscle incoordination, mental confusion, disorientation, and if it persists, can lead to the person's death. So we want to make sure that they get immediate medical attention with heat stroke. What are electrolytes? Well, electrolytes are substances that are going to dissociate into positively or negatively charged ions when they dissolve in water. So these are very, very important, these ions, these electrolytes, to the way water is distributed in the human body. So what are the serum electrolytes? Well, at the back of your course manual, I do have an appendix there with some general laboratory values. If you want to just take a look at those, just to have an idea if you're not already familiar with the concentrations in blood of electrolytes. But the cations, which are positively charged ions, are going to be sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. These are the major ones that we find in blood. The big ones here are sodium and potassium as far as fluid balance is concerned, but calcium and magnesium also play a smaller role. Anions. Anions are negatively charged ions. So these would be chloride and carbon dioxide, phosphorus, sulfate, lactate, and protein. All contribute as ions to fluid balance. Again, these are to a lesser extent involved in fluid balance than the cations. Here are some concentrations of major electrolytes. This is kind of a nice table because it does show you the plasma value versus the sweat value versus intracellularly for these 5 electrolytes. Okay, so sodium, potassium, and chloride are absolutely indispensable dietary constituents. We have to have these ions in the diet. We have to constantly replenish them. Why? Because, as related to the topic of sport nutrition here, very, very important in water balance and water distribution. And that's all about the osmotic equilibrium, So osmotic pressure, as we'll talk about, is very, very important in pushing water around the human body and making sure it needs to be where it's supposed to be. It's also very, very important as far as these ions are concerned in maintaining the acid-base balance. And of course, as I mentioned, intracellular and extracellular distribution of fluid is very, very important. So sodium, potassium, and chloride are critical to distributing this water properly and making sure things work properly. The electrolyte deficiencies, if you have any, are usually going to manifest in the athlete as muscle cramping. So typically if an athlete's experiencing muscle cramping, it's really related to sodium, potassium, and chloride. More often than not, you probably have heard the phrase, just have a banana and that'll take away your muscle cramping. Well, the reason why that most people are suggesting that you ingest bananas with muscle cramping is because it does have a decent amount of potassium in it, and that can restore some of the electrolyte deficiency that may have resulted from exercising. What is osmolality? This is very, very important as far as a concept in understanding how fluid is distributed in the human body. And osmolality is important because of what we call the osmotic pressure. This is the driving pressure for water. And essentially, what's happening here is that the concentration of molecules and ionic particles are regulating the osmotic pressure. The osmotic pressure is going to push water in various compartments. And as a general rule, the higher the osmolality of a solution, the greater the osmotic pressure is going to be. So the higher the solute concentration, the greater the osmotic pressure. And just as an example here, we've got 3 beakers listed below in this figure. In the very first beaker here, and I'll just label that 1, we have an A side and a B side separated by a semi-permeable membrane that's here, this blue dashed line. And in each of these compartments, we have solute particles, which are the red balls that you see here. And we have fluid surrounding these solute particles. So that's the diluent. So the water could be a good example of this as far as the diluent. And the solute particles, you could use the example of sodium here. In this example, in this beaker 1 here, we have an equilibrium that's been achieved as far as the osmolality is concerned. Both the side A and side B of the beaker has an equal amount of solute particles, and thus the osmotic pressure is going to be balanced. So there's no movement of water among these two sides of the beaker. Now, in beaker number 2, what we have done is we've added more solute particles to side B of the beaker. So when we increase the osmolality by increasing the amount of ionic particles there, what ends up happening is that now we have created a pressure difference in the water distribution. The osmotic pressure now is going to be driven towards side B of the beaker. So there are more solute particles. That's going to pull more water, more fluid across this semi-permeable membrane to balance out the osmolality here between beaker side A and B. So in number 3, what you see is that there's a higher amount of fluid inside B of the beaker. And that again is due to the osmotic pressure being higher inside B, which pulls more water to that side of the beaker. And this again is because of the solute concentration. So we increase the solute concentration, that is going to increase the osmotic pressure, and therefore you're going to pull more water into that particular compartment. The important concept to remember here is that the total number of solute particles per kilogram of water is going to determine fluid distribution. So the greater the solute concentration, the lower the water concentration. So you put more sodium in a given solution, you're going to have a lower amount of water concentration. And we can have this exist in 3 different states. So an isotonic solution is one where the osmolality is exactly the same. So there's no change in the solute or the diluent, and you're not going to get any movement of water. If we have a state where a solution is hypertonic, that means that the osmolality is actually greater. And this can happen because of 2 reasons. One, you've added more solute concentration, so there's now more solute, and that's exactly what we saw in the second beaker here in this diagram. So side B of beaker 2, we've added more solute concentration. Or it could also happen because of a lower diluent concentration. So in the case of dehydration, you lose water, that raises the concentration of solute in that given amount of blood volume, for example. So that would be a hypertonic solution. You can also have the solution exist as a hypotonic solution where you have a lower osmolality, and this again can happen because of 2 reasons. One, we can lower the overall amount of solute concentration, or we can also increase the diluent concentration. So we can add more water to, let's say, a solution where there's a given amount of solute there, and that would then result in a hypotonic solution. So one thing to note about this is that it only involves non-penetrating solutes. So you can't have a solute that can cross a semi-permeable membrane like the phospholipid bilayer and have it play a role in osmotic pressure. So basically the like sodium ions and potassium ions, these aren't necessarily moving freely. They have to be pumped in order to change their concentration in a given cell or compartment of the body. So these are the ones that are causing changes in osmotic pressure. So you can't have any movement of the solute particles across a semi-permeable membrane in order for it to exert osmotic pressure. The osmolality of blood is about 200 milliosmoles per kilogram. This is important because when we talk about sports beverages, you'll see that manufacturers try to keep their beverages around 280 milliosmoles. Now we can have osmolality affect the distribution of fluid inside and outside of the cells. So when intracellular osmolality is equal to extracellular osmolality, then there's not going to be any fluid movement. And that's what we call an isotonic solution. Now, if the intracellular osmolality is greater than extracellular osmolality, so the milliosmoles are more than 280 milliosmoles per kilogram within the cell, then fluids are going to enter the cell and the cell is going to swell. Now, if osmolality is lower intracellularly compared with extracellularly, so less than 280 milliosmoles per kilogram, then fluid is going to exit the cell and the cell is going to shrink. And if you're having trouble visualizing this, if you think about cucumbers, if you cut the cucumbers and then put some salt on top of the cucumbers and then come back a little while later, what ends up happening is that the sodium pulls water out of the cucumber. And that's because the osmolality is greater on the outside, or the osmotic pressure is going to be greater on the outside of that cucumber because sodium is pulling water out of the intracellular compartments of the cucumber. So a good rule of thumb to remember with sodium is that when sodium moves, water typically follows with it. What's the difference between osmolality and osmolarity? Well, in principle, it's exactly the same. The only difference is that the units are going to be slightly different. So for osmolality, it's osmoles or milliosmoles per kilogram of water. And this is the term that's typically preferred in a clinical setting. So for osmolarity, that's osmoles or milliosmoles per liter of solution. So that's the only difference there. So same concept, it's just that the units are expressed slightly different. What is water intoxication? Can water be dangerous to us? And the short answer is yes. What can happen is that we can put ourselves into a hyponatremic state. So hyponatremia, this is low blood concentrations of sodium. And this can be due to an excess of fluid consumption. So if you ingest copious amounts of water and or couple that with electrolyte loss, then you're going to end up in a state where sodium concentrations in blood end up being less than optimal. So less than 130 to 135 millimoles per liter would be what's considered hyponatremia. And this idea of water intoxication is very, very real. Several years ago, there was a radio contest where the idea was to ingest, I don't know how much water now, but it was a pretty large amount, maybe a gallon or maybe more than that of water, without going to the bathroom and urinating. And so there was a mom that called in to win a Nintendo Wii station and basically ended up doing this, and she won, but she ended up dying and left 2 kids behind because the folks at the radio station simply didn't understand that consuming a whole bunch of water can actually kill you. And this is the reason why. When you go into a hyponatremic state, that actually messes up the electrolyte balance in blood, and it messes up the electrical activity within the heart. And so you get these very dangerous arrhythmias within the myocardium, and you end up dying of a heart attack. So it's not something that you want to mess around with and overconsume water. There is a certain amount that we can consume that is safe. So we want to be careful of this when we're working with athletes and explain these the concepts to them. So the signs and symptoms here of water intoxication are going to include mimicking inebriation, so mimicking being drunk, muscle weakness, muscle incoordination, disorientation. It can even lead to seizures and a coma, and of course, eventually, as I discussed, death. Now, during exercise, we can actually mimic water intoxication. So how do we do this? Well, there's something called exercise-induced hyponatremia. And so this is when a person exercises for a prolonged period of time, and they're going to generate a certain amount of heat, and they raise core body temperature by 1 degree Celsius about every 5 to 8 minutes. And so what's going to happen there is, because of that increase in body temperature, we've got to contend with that additional heat. So we need to dissipate that heat. Otherwise, core body temperature, as you can see in this note, would increase to the point where we would collapse and die in about 15 to 30 minutes. So normally sweat is going to contain a low concentration of electrolytes. So sweat is mostly water with some electrolytes, some sodium and potassium, and some other substances that are released as well. So the plasma concentration of sodium and potassium would generally increase under this scenario. So as we sweat, we're losing mostly water and retaining a lot of the sodium and potassium. So plasma osmolality actually would increase. And this would suggest to us that perhaps we don't need to replace these concentrations. So less than 3 hours worth of work really doesn't require any sodium or chloride replacement, simply because it's mostly fluid that we're losing. However, there are inter-individual differences, so that is something that we want to be careful of, and of course focus on bio-individuality. So what ends up happening next is that the pituitary gland is going to increase antidiuretic hormone. So just the name of that should tell you what's going on here. We're trying to retain water and not lose water. So we're increasing the water retention by the kidney, and that's going to end up concentrating the urine. And we, in some cases, perhaps may end up with a nice dark gold color urine. We're also going to get aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex, which is going to facilitate an increase in sodium retention by the kidneys. Remember that this is a sodium-dependent mechanism, so we retain water by simply retaining more sodium, whereas the antidiuretic hormone, you're basically not allowing the nephron to be as leaky to the loss of water in the collecting tubule as you would with a euhydrated state. So that's going to trigger the thirst mechanism, right? So sodium concentrations increase, that hits the hypothalamus, and we now have this sensation of being thirsty. It should note that in some research, this signaling may actually be delayed with an acute bout of exercise. So it may not always be active to rely on the thirst mechanism, particularly in senior athletes. We really need to be careful of that. So, of course, this is going to vary according to the sweating rate of the individual, and we'll talk about calculating the sweat rate a little bit later on in the course. Training status plays a role here, and whether or not they're heat acclimatized also makes a difference as far as the amount of water that they're going to lose, the amount of electrolyte they're going to lose. So the more conditioned the athlete is, the lower the concentration of electrolytes is going to be in sweat. So you lose less sodium and potassium in sweat when you're more trained and more conditioned. Now, during prolonged exercise, more than 3 hours of exercise, you're going to get a significant loss of fluid and electrolytes in sweat, which then causes, of course, changes in electrolyte concentrations in the blood. So we're going to lower the sodium and chloride concentrations because we're losing now a lot more, or a significant amount, in sweat. Now, the problem here also is compounded by the fact that we could be consuming a high hypotonic fluid intake here. So we're consuming a fluid that doesn't have electrolyte in it, so it's hypotonic, doesn't have that osmolality concentration in large amounts, so that then causes the blood to be more hypotonic. So this can lead to a variety of neurological dysfunctions. If it's not treated, then a person can experience nausea, seizures, collapse, coma, and or death may actually ensue because of this. So we have a dilute concentration of sodium and potassium. Remember, that's necessary in order to maintain electrical functioning and a whole slew of other things in the human body. So for ultramarathon or prolonged events and prolonged triathlon events, we have a high risk of hyponatremia in these athletes because of this problem. So by losing the electrolyte in sweat because we're exercising, for long hours, and then we compound that problem by consuming more fluid. We're diluting the osmolality of blood, which then causes these problems to occur. So we need to be careful in these prolonged endurance events like ultramarathons, marathons, triathlon events. So we don't want to run into this condition of hyponatremia. Every year at the Boston Marathon, this seems to be a bit of a problem. In 2002, there were some researchers taking a look at this problem, and they found that 13% of the participants, so out of 488 folks, 488 people, were found to be hyponatremic. And again, the problem is that these folks have lost a large amount of electrolyte in sweat. They're consuming a whole bunch of hypotonic fluid, so they're probably consuming water. And in fact, during the race, what's interesting is that these athletes actually gained weight during the competition because they were drinking so much fluid. But they did have slower finishing times because they put themselves in this hyponatremic state, which again can be quite dangerous. What cofactors affect fluid consumption and absorption during exercise? So we've got fluid volume as number one here, point number one. So the greater the amount of fluid that's going to be consumed, the higher the rate of gastric emptying. And remember, this is referring to the stomach here, which would then lead to higher intestinal absorption. So most individuals are going to have gastric emptying rates that are about 1 liter or more per hour. So through research, they have found that up to about 600 milliliters of fluid ingestion is basically the threshold for where we get the most optimal or the greatest rate of gastric emptying. So again, the theory here is that we increase this larger amount of fluid that's going to then cause the stomach to empty at the highest rate, and then that's going to enter the small intestine so that we then can absorb that fluid in the duodenum and jejunum. So again, there's a point of diminishing returns here. So up to about 600 milliliters of fluid seems to be the threshold for the greatest amount of gastric emptying to occur. Of course, the electrolyte composition and concentration also makes a difference. So sodium solutions, usually as sodium chloride, are going to help. They're going to help maintain that plasma osmolality so we don't run into a situation where the person gets hyponatremic. Okay, so just ingesting the high concentrations of water is going to end up with lowering the plasma osmolality and thus the sodium concentration, which then is going to increase water excretion by the kidney. So we do want to be careful about the amount of just plain water we're consuming, particularly with those long endurance events. We're also going to, via sodium solutions, we're going to stimulate carbohydrate and water uptake in the gastrointestinal tract, which is a good thing. So we have that osmotic pressure driving water in the direction of the enterocyte. This will also help maintain vasopressin and aldosterone levels, so those hormones will be less likely to rev up, and this will help maintain urine output within normal limits instead of increasing urine output. Sodium solutions also help increase the palatability of the drink, believe it or not, so that'll help us be more interested in consuming that fluid. It maintains the drive to drink. There's a reason why, if you've ever gone to a bar where they have snacks on the bar, they're usually very, very salty, and that drives you to consume fluid. They want they want you to consume a whole bunch of fluid and buy more drinks, and that's because of the salt that's in those snacks. So same thing with athletes here. If you have just the right amount of sodium concentration in that beverage, it's going to promote drinking of that fluid. Now, some folks have gone the route of intravenous rehydration therapy, so that can happen in instances where the athlete is severely dehydrated, but as a proactive measure, there doesn't seem to be much evidence as far as it being a better way of rehydrating the person and keeping them euhydrated compared with consuming some sort of sports beverage. So as far as potassium is concerned, those needs are actually kind of small. You're not supposed to take potassium tablets. Sometimes salt tablets are given, but potassium tablets are kind of a bad idea because it can mess up the arrhythmias, or excuse me, the rhythm of the heart and induce arrhythmias. Osmolality also plays a role in absorption of fluid. Usually having mostly carbohydrate and some electrolytes is going to determine the osmolality of a beverage. So carbohydrate and electrolytes are very, very important when you're manufacturing a sports beverage because that will affect the osmolality. And so we know as the osmolality increases, we can actually decrease the gastric emptying rate. So we need to be really careful about how much we affect the osmolality. Now, what's interesting is that gastric emptying does tend to be more affected by the energy density, so it's more related to the amount of carbohydrate in the sports drink beverage compared with the electrolyte that's affecting the osmolality. So osmolality, as you recall, can be isotonic, hypertonic, or hypotonic. And it turns out that through current research that we want to strive for 200 milliosmoles per kilogram. And if you recall, that's the osmolality of blood. So it seems, very interestingly so, that staying as isotonic as possible seems to be the best way to optimize gastric emptying. So this is especially important with nutrient-containing beverages due to the energy density of those beverages. So carbohydrate-loaded beverages really are concerned with affecting the osmolality. Now, what's interesting, and again to the point that it's more about the energy density or the amount of calories a beverage has, is that when you look at research studies that used pure plain electrolyte solutions, so no energy density whatsoever, they had a high osmolality as a result of all those electrolytes, and it hardly affected gastric emptying. So there's something about having carbohydrate in that particular substance that is going to affect the osmolality, and that's a major concern when you're trying to manufacture one of these beverages. Slightly hypotonic solutions may actually be more effective when rapid dehydration is desired. There is some evidence to suggest this. Dilute glucose electrolyte solutions relative to a hypertonic plasma may actually increase the rate of water uptake. However, again, we need further investigation in order to determine whether or not this is something we want to recommend in athletes that are severely dehydrated and need to replenish those fluids, or perhaps they're got several meets that day, several events that they're participating in, and you need quick rehydration. So that may be the way to go as far as those athletes are concerned. The carbohydrate concentration, obviously, as we've discussed, is also going to affect the absorptive rates here. A hypertonic solution is going to cause a net secretion of water into the intestinal lumen. So if you've ever experienced this at Halloween, where you consume a whole bunch of candy and next thing you know, you've got stomach cramps. Well, the reason is because you've created this hypertonic solution within the gastrointestinal tract lumen. So that actually pulls water out of the enterocyte, out of the bloodstream, and causes what's called the reverse osmotic effects. So you get bloating, cramping, diarrhea may also be a problem here. So that's going to, of course, upset the GI tract balance and blood balance as far as osmolality is concerned, and where you're driving the water, and can actually decrease the rate of gastric emptying and thus intestinal absorption. So that presents a greater acute danger of rehydration here. So we want to make sure that carbohydrate concentration isn't too high. And companies, manufacturers of sports drinks, spend millions of dollars a year trying to figure out ways to circumvent this very issue. So it seems that a solution greater than 8 to 10% of carbohydrate in concentration in a sports beverage is actually going to cause this GI upset. So currently, about a 6% carbohydrate solution is what's recommended to get a similar rate of absorption to water. So you can provide a little bit of carbohydrate and the fluid necessary, and that would be equivalent to drinking water as far as the absorption into the enterocyte and thus into the bloodstream would be. So if we increase carbohydrate in solutions, we're going to increase the ingestion of carbohydrate and therefore delivery. But again, dehydration consequences are far greater of a concern rather than getting the carbohydrate. So we want to stay focused on hydration and not necessarily carbohydrate intake during prolonged activity. That's not to say that that's not important, because we want to strive for about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour of exercise to ensure that plasma concentrations of glucose remain at steady levels so that the central nervous system is getting what it needs, so that you offset some of the glycogen depletion that's going on with extensive exercise. So you're helping to provide energy when you do this sort of regimen. It turns out the type of carbohydrate is also important as far as absorption is concerned. So glucose, sucrose, and glucose polymers all digest well. And glucose polymers are really where the industry has focused on in trying to deliver more carbohydrate without affecting the osmolality and without getting that reverse osmotic effect of drawing water out of the enterocytes and into the gastrointestinal tract wall. So they seem to work very, very nicely in unison in products that are out on the market. So a glucose polymer substitution for free glucose would be a better way to go, because that's going to increase the carbohydrate concentration, again, without tinkering too much with that osmolality, and thus you're not going to have those shifts in fluid in the wrong direction. So this is actually perhaps going to increase gastric emptying, enhance it, and therefore the intestinal uptake of fluid and substrate is going to be continued and optimized. The effect is magnified at high polymer concentrations, so more than 180 grams per liter. So there's a high energy density. However, because they are glucose polymers and they kind of escape the mechanisms of normal transport and sensing that glucose present, they are going to not affect osmolality as much. So it could be that this is the way to go, and a lot of manufacturers have gone this way, and playing around with different glucose polymers and trying to optimize carbohydrate delivery and getting the energy to the athlete without affecting osmolarity to a large extent. So a lot of post-exercise beverages are on the market as well that try to promote the replacement of glycogen without having too much of an offset for the athlete as far as being able to intake a large amount of carbohydrate. So it's not going to impair water or glucose uptake, and that's important for replenishing glycogen stores. It's important for maintaining electrolyte concentrations and getting fluid intake. So large quantities of fructose have been shown to increase gastrointestinal distress, so particularly during exercise. So that's not necessarily a way to go as far as getting your carbohydrates. There's a slower rate of absorption compared with glucose. It promotes less water uptake compared with glucose. And it sometimes is included in sport drinks in very small amounts just because of palatability. Make these beverages taste good. If you've ever tried some of these products like gels and whatnot, sometimes they can have kind of an off or unusual texture or flavor to them, and that may not necessarily be palatable to everyone. Particularly if you start using them at a competition, which I would never recommend. So you always want to practice the plan and whatever substance you want to ingest far in advance to make sure that the athlete is comfortable with doing that particular regimen. So some studies do show an improvement in gastric emptying when you combine glucose and other monosaccharides. So that's an important consideration here in the literature. As far as intestinal transport is concerned, it might be the rate limiting step in the oxidation of carbohydrates. So getting past that brush border membrane and into the enterocyte, that may be where the research has to focus in order to bypass that somehow and optimize that so we can help athletes achieve optimal performance with sports beverages and maintain that performance over a prolonged period of time. As far as taste and flavorings are concerned, this can be important. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if a beverage doesn't taste very palatable to an athlete, they probably aren't going to consume it. So we want to increase the palatability of the beverage so that we can increase consumption. In fact, research has shown that that can increase by about 50% in consumption of the beverage if there are palatable flavors present. So that's an important consideration. If you're working with children, as far as athletes are concerned, grape flavor does seem to be the flavor of choice and is associated with much higher intake. So if you're going to work with kids, with children that are athletes, grape seems like a safe flavor to get them to drink fluid and carbohydrate. So taste is a very, very important factor for consumption of a particular beverage. Now, one thing to consider as well here is we want to look at sodium content. If you have an athlete that doesn't have a lot of sodium in their diet and then you have them consume a beverage that does, that actually may be not palatable or unpalatable to the diet, to the athlete, So we want to make sure that, yes, we do have sodium in that beverage, but that we're not having excessive amounts. The beverage temperature also makes a difference as whether or not someone is going to consume it. Usually, cooler is going to be better as far as palatability is concerned. However, as far as gastric emptying is concerned, there really is no difference between the cooler and the warmer beverage. It's more about palatability and getting that beverage into that athlete's body. As far as exercise intensity is concerned, we know that once you start to creep up to the higher intensities, so greater than 70% VO2 max, gastric emptying is going to slow. And if you think about this does make sense because there's a demand for oxygen, and so blood needs to be delivered to the working muscle. And if you're trying to push more blood to the muscle, there's not enough to go around and not enough to split between the gastrointestinal tract and muscle tissue. So you start diverting blood away from the gastrointestinal tract at higher intensities, and therefore that's going to slow down the rate of gastric emptying simply because you can't deliver the necessary blood flow to the GI tract at these high intensities to transport the nutrients that are being absorbed. With a 7% or lower carbohydrate concentration, that seems to be well tolerated at these higher intensities. So a lot of sports drinks really strive for that 6% carbohydrate solution because they know that's well tolerated, particularly at higher intensity types of exercise. Environmental conditions are obviously important when it comes to consuming fluids and absorption of fluids. So we want to make sure that during cold weather exercise that the person is a little bit more cognizant of fluid intake because colder air is generally drier airs, and there's actually a decrease in the ability to sense thirst. So that mechanism isn't working as great, but yet we have an increase in the frequency of urination, and when we're increasing our minute ventilation, so through respiration, we're going to promote more fluid loss. That means that we need to be a little bit more cognizant of fluid replacement. In hot and humid weather, obviously, this is a primary concern. We know that in a laboratory setting, we can keep the work rate fixed, and if we increase the temperature of the laboratory, as was done in this particular study, we can see that going from 11 degrees Celsius to 31 degrees Celsius actually reduced the amount of time until athletes fatigue. So this is a time to fatigue trial of athletes by simply manipulating the ambient temperature. And as you increase the ambient temperature, you're going to reduce the amount of time that the person can exercise. They will fatigue sooner. And the interesting part about it is that it's not because of a depletion in muscle glycogen. In fact, even at 40 degrees Celsius in this particular study, it was found to be adequate. So there's something about the hot and humid environment, basically the electrolyte concentration, the amount of water in plasma volume, that's going to affect performance here. That shift from the core and reducing central venous pressure and pushing that blood out to the periphery all has an effect on performance levels. We also know that at a loss of 2% body mass for fluids, we're going to have impairment in work capacity. In fact, a research study looked at this very issue and found that losses of body mass greater than 5% decrease work capacity by about 30%. So that's pretty significant when it comes to exercise performance. We also know that when the ambient temperature is greater than body temperature, our sweat mechanism is going to kick in. And it's interesting to look at heat removal. If 1 liter of water is lost from the skin, that's actually going to evacuate 580 kilocalories of heat. So it's a very important mechanism that our bodies have in order to dissipate some of this heat, to get that heat out of the body so that we can maintain that core temperature as close to 37 degrees Celsius as possible and maintain chemical reactions working optimally. Now we also again lose some moisture through, or fluid through, breathing. We have an increase in minute ventilation during exercise, so we're going to lose a lot more fluid that way. It's important to note that being thirsty, the sensation of being thirsty, is not always going to allow an athlete to drink more fluid. They're not necessarily going to drink more just because they're thirsty. They may ignore it for a little while, and then by that point they've lost a certain amount of fluid, and that could lead to impairment. So we need to make sure that athletes are proactive about their fluid plan and fluid consumption during exercise. It's also important to note that during the first few days of acclimatization to an environment, especially a hot and humid environment, athletes are going to experience a greater loss of sodium in sweat. So even though they're well trained, you're actually going to lose a little bit more sodium in through sweat and in blood as a result of that. So there is an adjustment period. Now, exercise at altitude also kind of compounds the problem here as well. At an altitude at about 5,300 feet above sea level, you're going to start to see some changes here. Air temperature does drop with every 500 feet in altitude. So it's cooler air, thus it's going to be drier air. To compensate at altitude for lower oxygen pressures, so the pressure of inspired oxygen is lower with an increase in altitude, what's going to happen there is you have less driving pressure of oxygen in the blood, which means that less is going to be delivered to the working muscle. And to compensate for that, what the body does is actually increases minute ventilation. So the bulk movement of air in and out of the lung actually increases, and you compound that with drier air, you're going to create a higher rate of insensible loss of water simply because you're breathing more to compensate for the decrease in oxygen pressure at higher altitude. Now, as far as insensible skin losses are concerned here, because of the drier air, again, the athlete may not be as perceptive to the amount of fluid loss simply because of the dry air at altitude. Some special notes here. Some athletes do vary in their sweat rate, and so that sweat rate can actually exceed the amount of gastric emptying that they have the ability to do, which means then you're going to absorb less fluid and be less likely to maintain a fluid balance during prolonged exercise. So that is something that is a concern and that you should be aware of, is that not everybody has the same sweat rate. Now, some recent evidence suggests that if you add just a little bit of caffeine to a carbohydrate electrolyte solution, that may enhance glucose intestinal absorption and contribution to energy production. So caffeine may actually be beneficial. But again, further research is needed to make mass general recommendations. So the best thing really is to practice a fluid plan. If you choose to include a beverage that has caffeine in it, then you should practice this well ahead of time to make sure that there aren't any side effects to consuming that caffeine. And in fact, it leads to some sort of a real and appreciable effect as far as exercise performance is concerned. Is a sports drink useful for an athlete? It is generally accepted that ingestion of a sports drink during exercise that is going to be lasting in duration more than 40 to 60 minutes may actually enhance exercise performance. So the benefit to this really comes from the fact that we are supplementing the endogenous stores of energy, particularly in the latter stages of exercise, not early on, but later on in activity. And we know this through radioactive tracer studies. So you give somebody some radioactive glucose and you monitor where that glucose goes. And basically, early on, those ingested carbohydrates aren't really being oxidized in the first 60 minutes of exercise. Where we do see that oxidation is occurring later on in activity. So perhaps carbohydrate ingestion needs to begin early in order to be beneficial and in order to take advantage of it. So we want to be proactive about the carbohydrate intake as far as a sports drink being useful for an athlete. The type of exercise is going to be important. So when should we recommend a sports drink? Well, if the exercise is prolonged and it's of moderate intensity, then we want to consider a sports beverage. If the athlete is performing intermittent high-intensity bouts of exercise, that would also be another condition where we want to recommend a sports beverage. There is limited evidence that suggests that perhaps a team and a racket event could benefit from a sports drink as well, particularly any high-intensity work lasting about an hour or so. So there may be some benefit there to those athletes consuming a sports beverage as well. Carbohydrate electrolytes solutions tend to be a little bit more effective at hydrating than just plain water. So sports beverages for the appropriate athlete can actually improve hydration and establish a better maintenance of fluid balance and electrolyte balance. Gatorade was, if you don't know the story behind this, but Gatorade was developed by scientists at the University of Florida within the College of Medicine for, I believe it was the football team. So the University of Florida Gators benefited from having Gatorade. This actually laid the foundation for what has become known as the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And every year at the American College of Sports Medicine Conference, they always have a big booth in there displaying all their new products. So if you ever get a chance to go to an ACSM conference, you'll get to see the Gatorade Sports Science Institute products that are available now that are always cutting edge and trying to push the boundaries of increasing carbohydrate intake and fluid optimization and keeping gastric emptying without actually affecting osmolality negatively. What should I look out for in a sports drink? If I'm going to recommend one, what are the things to look for? Well, you want to look at the type of carbohydrate. Glucose, sucrose, and glucose polymers have become the standards. However, I did see some work recently that involved some fructose, and it seems that if it was combined with glucose, that it seemed okay to have in the sports beverage. But again, we need a little bit more work in that area to figure out whether or not we can consume fructose, generally speaking, for athletes. About a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution is where these sports beverages tend to keep their carbohydrate content too. We do want to watch out for artificial sweeteners. Sometimes high consumption of the artificial sweeteners can trigger adverse side effects. There's always the concern of health effects, prolonged use of these substances. Do they lead to anything down the road for the athlete health-wise? So that is a concern. Stimulants, we want to be wary of any caffeine in that sports beverage. Any guarana and kola nut would also be indicative of some sort of stimulant there. And these are usually packaged as those energy drinks that have become so popular recently. And so we want to try and be careful with these and mitigate them accordingly based on the athlete's needs and how they respond to them by practicing the intake of these beverages far ahead of time before competition. We also want to look at high doses of vitamins and minerals. Generally speaking, sodium, potassium, and chloride are the ones that we want to look out for and want to have in our sports drinks. If you start to lean and favor high doses of other micronutrients, that can actually cause gastrointestinal distress. So it does no good to the athlete to have some cramping in the GI tract when they're trying to perform at their best. So we want to be careful of other micronutrients. Again, practicing the fluid plan way ahead of competition is really key to avoiding any decreases in performance on race day or competition day. So the way to avoid some of these GI issues is basically to look at your food label, and if the micronutrient in question that's not sodium, potassium, or chloride is greater than 10 to 20% of the daily value per serving, then you may want to consider using a different sports supplement. Carbonation is an important consideration as well, because the effervescent bubbles can actually take up a bunch of space in the stomach, which then can lead to a bloated or full feeling, which again, that can deter from the athlete performing well. There are specialty formulas that have been developed, a lot of them by the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, that break things down into a pre-exercise, during exercise, and a recovery formula, which is kind of a neat concept. The pre-exercise formula generally have much higher amounts of carbohydrate. However, if you look at the cost of these things, they're fairly expensive. They're not readily available in grocery stores. So really just having a well-balanced diet that is adequate in kilocalories, that is giving the athlete some carbohydrates, would be the most important consideration. During exercise and ultra endurance formulas that are out there on the market, generally higher. These are generally higher in sodium and electrolytes, and they actually may be useful for endurance events lasting greater than 3 hours. So these types of formulas are specifically geared towards prolonged endurance events, and is a consideration for the athlete that you're working with. And again, practicing the fluid plan and the consumption of these beverages or these formulas is important far in advance of the competition. Then there are also recovery formulas that basically have carbohydrate, protein, and some antioxidants. And these are great if the athlete is, having several events in a short amount of time, or they're traveling. So that may be a good use of the athlete's money and trying to get these recovery formulas. So that's important if they don't have immediate access to food. How can I calculate an athlete's sweat rate? So I want to be able to look at how much fluid an athlete's going to lose in a given period of time, so I can determine how much they sweat and then appropriately regulate the consumption of fluid to match the output of sweat and loss of fluid in that athlete. So what I do is I conduct a sweat trial. And what you're going to end up doing is have the athlete work out for, let's say, a 1 hour or a 2 hour block of time, and they can't urinate during that time. So basically you want to avoid the bladder before you start this. And you're going to measure body mass before they actually exercise, and then you measure it afterwards. So that's important. You want to get a weigh-in before they exercise and after they exercise. And avoid urination in between, because urination would complicate the calculation. You would have to actually collect the urine samples and then measure the amount of fluid and water in urine in order to come up with the sweat rate. So we want to avoid urinating during that time. Now, I should point out that some body mass loss is going to be due to oxidation of substrates during exercise, so you'll lose some there. And you also could run an example of gaining body mass from producing so much metabolic water. So that may happen during the sweat trial. So then what we're going to do is we're going to convert the number of pounds lost during exercise to ounces. So for every pound that the athlete loses, that's about 2 to 3 cups or 16 to 24 ounces of fluid. So we take our pounds lost and multiply that by 16 to 24 ounces. I would do the whole range. I would do the low range, 16 and 24. This way you have that broad range of fluid loss. Then you're going to determine the actual fluid needs of the athlete during an identical workout. So basically what you want to do here is take the ounces of fluid consumed during the exercise. So that's one thing that you do want to monitor during this time frame that you're evaluating the athlete. So if they're exercising for 1 to 2 hours, you want to have a measured amount of fluid that they consume. So have a bottle with a known amount of fluid, and as they consume that fluid, at the end of the sweat trial, you are going to see how much fluid they actually drank. And so you want the number of ounces of fluid to basically be added to the ounces of additional fluid needed to establish fluid balance. So basically here what you're going to do is see how many ounces of fluid they drank and add that to the fluid that they lost through their body mass evaluation. And so that then becomes the total fluid need that they would need in order to maintain euhydration. So you determine the number of fluid ounces needed during exercise. You take your total fluid needs, divide that by the total workout time in hours, and that gives you fluid ounces per hour of exercise. Let's look at an example of this. So I perform a sweat trial, and this is what I come up with. I determined that before they exercised, they weighed 145 pounds. After they finish their exercise, I see that they weigh 143 pounds. So that stands for a 2-pound loss of water. Now, as far as additional fluid needed, what we want to do is take our 2 pounds of water loss here, multiply that by our ounce range of 16 to 24 ounces, which gives us 32 to 48 ounces of water that the person needs to consume in order to compensate for the 2-pound loss. However, that's not the total fluid need. What we need to do now is take into consideration how much fluid they drank during their sweat trial. So in this example, it appears that they have drank 20 ounces of fluid. So we need to take that 20 ounces into consideration here and add that to the 32 to 48 ounces that we determined that they lost during the sweat trial in terms of the amount of body mass that they lost. So when we add those two together, we get 52 to 68 ounces of fluid that they actually need to consume. So to determine how much they need per hour, what we do is take our 52 to 68 ounces, divide it by our 2 hours worth of exercise that we monitored the athlete during this sweat trial, and that ends up coming out to 26 to 34 ounces of fluid per hour that this athlete needs to consume in order to maintain a good euhydrated state. So a sweat trial is very useful in determining an individual sweat rate. So the practical application of all this material, this is what we want to consider. We want to consider the current nutritional status. So if someone's on a low sodium diet or they have poorly balanced meals and not consuming all their nutrients, then particularly with fluid and electrolytes, then we want to consider some sodium containing beverages. So a sports drink is really sufficient in order to compensate for the sodium and potassium, etc. So about 0.3 to 0.7 grams per liter would help in some of these scenarios. But again, we want to individualize the fluid plan. We also want to look at the time of fluid ingestion. So we want to make it readily available. It does the athlete no good if the fluid isn't available until 2 or 3 hours from now. We need to practice our fluid plan and make sure the athlete is getting and consuming fluid early on, as soon as exercise begins. So coaches should be aware of this problem, and they should allow for lots of fluid breaks and plan for fluid breaks in training and during competition. We want to begin consumption early in an exercise bout, because we know that this is going to help with maintaining, particularly with glucose concentrations, and staving off that glycogen depletion. The type and intensity of exercise is important to consider here. The higher intensities may induce a higher sweat rate, which means that we're going to have higher losses of electrolytes and higher loss of fluid. So we want to consider that as well. We want to consider individual preference. Fluid should taste good to the athlete. Otherwise, they are not going to consume it. So palatability is paramount. Diuretics, whether or not the person is on diuretics, is important, and an important consideration. Whether or not they're consuming large amounts of fluids that promote diuresis or urination, that's an important consideration here, because we need to compensate for those fluid losses. Environmental conditions are important, as we discussed. We want to make sure that on those cold days that we may get a lower sweat rate, but we've got insensible losses that could be present. We also want to make sure that we understand that during colder weather, our primary concern is carbohydrates. So just because I'm not going to have my athlete consume a sports beverage doesn't mean that carbohydrates aren't important. We need to consider carbohydrates as well. On those hot and humid days, we can increase the sweat rate. So again, we may need a more aggressive fluid intake, and the best way to do that is to consume some of these carbohydrate electrolyte-rich solutions. We need to consider acclimation to weather as well. That's important. So early on during the acclimation process, we're going to sweat out more electrolyte. And so as we progress through our acclimation, then that becomes less and less of an issue. As far as pre-exercise hydration, what should we consider? Well, we want to make sure that we are weighing the athlete before exercise or competition. So we want to weigh the person with an empty bladder and at the exact same time of day, so that we don't have any diurnal variation present. We want to have the athlete evaluate their urine color as well as the odor. And a simple way to do that is use this table below to have the athlete associate their urine color with a urine reading, which then can be interpreted by the healthcare practitioner that is looking at these aspects and determining how much fluid is necessary for that athlete to consume. Now, you should note that if the athlete is on some sort of vitamin or mineral supplementation, that can change the color of urine. Can give it a yellow tint, so sometimes you can get some off results that way, and it may not be accurate to look at urine color to determine whether or not the person is hydrated on their fluid plan. We want to try to strive for always exercising well hydrated, so in that hydrated state. The goal here, remember, in athletes is to optimize performance. That's what athletes are concerned about. They want to perform at their very best. And nutrition should be something that they don't think about during their performance. All they're thinking about is doing the sport or event and performing well. They don't want to be concerned with nutrition. So we need to make sure that they're well hydrated, so they're not thinking about these aspects. They need to, at least 2 to 3 hours of exercise, consume 400 to 600 milliliters of fluid. So that's 14 to 22 ounces. And it doesn't stop there. So at about 10 to 20 minutes before exercise, they then want to go ahead and consume an additional 200 to 300 milliliters, or 7 to 11 ounces of fluid. And then, of course, rehydrating between events is important. We need to make sure that we get at least 80% of the fluids lost replaced before the next bout of exercise in order to maintain exercise performance. We could use things like water, juices, milk. We could consume caffeinated coffee or tea, but we want to do so in moderation so that we don't promote diuresis. And of course, we want to avoid sodas because of that effervescent effect and having any stomach bloating issues. In general, the goal during exercise for hydration is basically to maintain plasma volume and electrolyte balance. So in the next several slides, what we're going to look at are specific recommendations for given periods of time of exercise. The first of which is exercise lasting 30 minutes in duration. Is there any concern here? And in general, there really isn't any concern as far as fluid ingestion, because fluid ingestion has very, very little effect during this short time frame of exercise. And this is, of course, assuming that we're entering exercise or performing exercise in a euhydrated state. So there really isn't a concern as far as being able to compete at optimal performance. Once we begin to exercise longer than that, 30 to 60 minutes in duration, the primary concern is going to be, of course, fluid intake and some carbohydrate intake. There's some evidence to suggest that even in this short amount of time that we could delay the onset of fatigue by having a combination of carbohydrate and some fluid. If you just drank water, that actually could run into a scenario where you dilute blood electrolytes. You might increase the urine output and decrease the drive to drink, which then would increase the risk for dehydration. So as I've been recommending all along, we always want to practice the fluid plan. So if you have an athlete that's exercising or competing for a 30 to 60 minute time frame, we want to practice that fluid plan far in advance. Of course, we want to have a cool beverage because that's a little bit more palatable, anywhere between 59 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. It should be palatable and have some carbohydrate in it. About 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate is where we like to keep our carbohydrates at on a per hour basis. Up to about an 8% carbohydrate solution will be tolerable as far as gastrointestinal tract distress is concerned. So anything more than that, you could run into gastrointestinal distress and, of course, discomfort for the athlete while they're exercising. So a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution is where most of these sport drinks are going to keep their carbohydrate content to, about 60 to 70 grams of carbohydrate for about 1 liter per hour. So we want to ingest this sports drink or this beverage regularly. This maintains the gastric volume. Remember that 600 milliliters we were talking about, where we can optimize gastric emptying. So that's going to allow fluid to be available for absorption. So how do we do this? Well, by ingesting about 150 to 350 milliliters of fluid, or 6 to 12 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes, we're ensuring that we're going to optimize that gastric emptying. So it's the volume that's more important here rather than the timing of the consumption. So making sure that the athlete gets that 150 to 350 milliliters or 6 to 12 ounces is really, really important, more so than the timing of it. So we also want to make sure that the athlete takes the most of opportunities available to them in order to rehydrate. So again, ingesting the appropriate amount of volume of sports beverage. When we take exercise out to 1 to 3 hours in duration, again, the primary concern here, fluid replacement as well as carbohydrate intake. So we want to ensure that the athlete begins early with fluid ingestion, and they continue to ingest every 15 to 20 minutes. We want to make sure that they're getting that 150 to 350 milliliters or 6 to 12 ounces of fluid so that they can maintain the gastric volume and, of course, allow fluid to be available for absorption in the small intestine. As far as carbohydrate, again, 30 to 60 grams per hour of exercise is what's recommended. And of course, drinking a cool beverage is much more palatable for the athlete, so keeping that 15 to 20 degrees Celsius or 59 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, as with all of these scenarios, individualized recommendations and a practice fluid plan is what is going to be the best for any given athlete because it's tailored to their individual needs. When we take exercise beyond 3 hours in duration, we start to see more importance of the electrolytes. So yes, fluid is important, carbohydrate replacement is important, but now we really want to pay attention to those sodium losses. Again, practicing a fluid plan is very important, keeping the beverage cool, palatable with carbohydrate as well as sodium. We also want to take in consideration here with given the amount of time that these folks are exercising, that we perhaps may want to choose different flavors so that we don't get something called flavor fatigue. So we can easily get tired of ingesting the same flavor over and over again. So if we change it up, we can avoid issues with that. Again, that's something that we want to practice ahead of time so that we know how the athlete's going to respond. So beginning fluid ingestion early on and continuing to ingest it, very, very important here. We want to maintain that gastric volume so we can have that fluid available for absorption. So once again, 150 to 350 milliliters of fluid, or 6 to 12 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes is what's recommended. This ensures about a 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour of exercise, and in some instances, again, since we've practiced this ahead of time, we actually may need more carbohydrate to delay the onset of fatigue. As far as sodium is concerned, again, we want to make sure that we know what the athlete's sweat rate is so that we can plan ahead of time for sodium repletion. So this is where sports drinks are really useful in trying to get everything that these hard-working athletes need to replenish all of their carbohydrates as well as electrolytes. So as far as a prolonged skill-based sport like archery or golf or shooting or bowling, what's the primary concern here? Well, again, it depends on the environment that you're in, but most of the time we're just looking at fluid as well as carbohydrate. Once again, we can't emphasize this enough. Practicing the fluid plan ahead of time prior to competition is important. A cool, palatable beverage is always a good choice for most athletes. Again, if the athlete prefers it a little bit colder, then of course accommodating would always be best. As far as hydration after exercise, one of the important things to do prior to exercise, after exercise, is to weigh the athlete. So we want to make sure that we get the body weight and make sure that we see what the percent change of body mass is. And so this table is a nice little table that allows you to look at the percent body mass change. It also lets you look at urine color as well as urine-specific gravity if you are measuring that, and categorizing whether or not the athlete is well hydrated or minimally hydrated or is significant dehydrated or seriously dehydrated. So this helps us quantify and characterize the state of dehydration after exercise so that we can then replete the athlete with the appropriate amount of fluid and electrolyte. So what are the recommendations? Well, we want to drink about 450 to 675 milliliters of fluid, or 16 to 24 ounces, or 2 to 3 cups for every pound of weight that's lost. This should include electrolyte as well as carbohydrate. But the problem here that you may run into, you get an athlete who's really, really thirsty and wants to rehydrate very quickly. The tendency is to consume large amounts of water in a very short period of time, which actually can delay rehydration and in some cases promote more frequent urination, and that would still keep you in a dehydrated state. So that's important to recognize as well, that we want to consume the fluid, the water, or the sports drink a little bit slower than perhaps the athlete would like, so that we don't run into these issues of delayed rehydration. So here is a table of the summary of recommendations for athletes. So in this column, there's the daily recommendation, just general recommendations for adequate intake for most people. We've got 2 to 3 hours prior to exercise. How much should we be consuming? About 14 to 22 ounces there. And then 15 to 20 minutes pre-exercise, consuming 7 to 11 ounces of fluid. And then during exercise, every 10 to 20 minutes, we're going to consume about 6 to 12 ounces of fluid. And then post-exercise, 16 to 24 ounces per pound of body mass loss within 2 hours of completion of the exercise. So all of this is an effort to try and maintain proper hydration and proper electrolyte balance, and therefore plasma volume balance in the bloodstream. And there are some recommendations down here at the bottom that you can go ahead and take a look at as far as what could the athlete consume to achieve these goals. So some special notes about fluids and electrolytes here. Number one is that carbohydrate ingestion during exercise actually can help attenuate the immunosuppressive response to exercise. When athletes perform prolonged, strenuous endurance type of exercise, so really long, high-intensity exercise, that actually increases levels of cortisol and catecholamines in the bloodstream, which tends to suppress the immune system, which then places the athlete at risk for illness, particularly URTI or upper respiratory tract infections. So by having that carbohydrate ingestion, there's actually some evidence to suggest that that helps reduce the occurrence of this stress-induced immunosuppressiveness that we see. As far as children and adolescents are concerned, the most important point to remember is really that there's a higher set point for the initiation of sweating. So in other words, the child or adolescent is actually going to get much hotter than an adult would before they actually start engaging the sweating mechanism to cool their body off. They also have a lower rate of sweating, so there's a reduced capacity here to dissipate that heat. So they produce more metabolic heat per kilogram of body weight during exercise than adults, which means that we can increase that core body temperature much faster. So we need to be a little bit more proactive about our fluid intake and electrolyte replacement. A child that's less than 10 years of age, it's recommended that they drink until they are not thirsty, and then drink an additional half a glass, 1/3 to a half a cup of fluid.